Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to share with you an incredible story that you won't want to miss. Racist call to cops backfires. When black teen's mom shows up as FBI chief. Imagine this. A young black teen simply trying to buy a gift for his sister when he's wrongfully accused of theft at an upscale jewelry store. The store clerk calls the cops, and before long he's being handcuffed. But here's where the story takes a twist. His mom is no ordinary woman. She's an FBI chief, and she's about to change everything. This powerful tale is not just about race and prejudice. It's about justice, strength, and standing up for what's right. Stay tuned to hear how this story unfolds and how a mother's love becomes a powerful force for change. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire change. Riverton was a peaceful suburban town where life moved at a slow and steady pace. On weekends, families strolled through the park, children ran toward the swings, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings on their way to the local farmer's market. The golden afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the streets, creating a picturesque atmosphere. Yet for Jalen Carter, this Saturday was more than just another quiet day in the neighborhood. Jalen, 17 years old, a young black man, found himself navigating the delicate balance between ambition and the harsh realities of the world. He had been working at a local coffee shop in Riverton for months, carefully saving every penny he earned. Every tip, every paycheck was set aside with one goal in mind: to buy his younger sister, Aaliyah, the perfect birthday gift. Jalen had been dreaming about this moment for a long time. The moment he could give Aaliyah something meaningful that showed how much he loved her despite all the hardships they had faced as a family. Today was the day. After weeks of scrimping and saving, Jalen finally had enough to buy the gift. He was heading to Belmont Jewelers, Riverton's most prestigious jewelry store, to purchase a silver charm bracelet for his sister. He had passed the store countless times, always admiring the display cases filled with sparkling jewelry, but never able to afford anything. Today he was determined to change that. This wasn't just about the bracelet. It was about proving to Aaliyah that no matter the struggles they'd endured, their bond was stronger than anything else. As Jalen walked toward the jewelry store, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. His hoodie was slightly unzipped, revealing a neatly pressed polo shirt underneath. He wore a pair of dark jeans and comfortable sneakers, simple but practical. He knew that people might judge him based on his appearance, especially being a young black man in a high-end store, but he was determined not to let that affect him today. He was here for one reason: to buy his sister a gift. Stepping inside the store, the cool air and the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne immediately hit him. Belmont Jewelers was everything he had imagined: a sleek and modern space with velvet-lined display cases filled with gleaming gold and silver jewelry. The lighting made every item sparkle under the bright, almost blinding lights. Most of the customers inside were older women, dressed in expensive clothes, admiring the diamond rings and necklaces. Jalen felt out of place among them, but he focused on what he came for: the charm bracelet. Behind the counter stood Margaret Whitmore, a middle-aged white woman with carefully styled blonde hair and sharp, calculating eyes. At first, her expression was neutral, but as soon as she noticed Jalen walking up, something in her demeanor shifted. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands gripped the counter a little too tightly. Jalen felt the shift in the air, the subtle but undeniable suspicion that always seemed to follow him. She was judging him before he even spoke. Jalen tried to keep his cool. He stepped up to the counter with a polite smile. "I'd like to see that bracelet," he said, his voice steady. Margaret didn't immediately move. She simply folded her arms and eyed him up and down, clearly sizing him up. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "That one's quite expensive." Jalen's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. He pulled his wallet out, showing her the cash he had worked so hard to save. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I have the money right here." Margaret's eyes flicked to the cash, then back to Jalen. She didn't seem impressed. In fact, she tensed even more, her fingers hovering over the phone on the counter. "Where exactly did you get all that money?" she asked, her voice casual, but with an underlying accusation. Jalen clenched his jaw, already knowing where this conversation was headed. He forced himself to keep calm. I work at Parker's Coffee House. I saved up for this, he explained, emphasizing each word to make sure she understood. Margaret scoffed, her skepticism evident. Well, I suppose I should be flattered that you thought you could fool me, she said, shaking her head slightly. But I've been working here a long time, kid. I know when something doesn't add up. Jalen felt the anger rising, but he kept his hands at his sides, trying to remain calm. He had come here for something simple, but it seemed like it was about to turn into something much more difficult. Can I just see the bracelet, please? He asked again, trying to maintain his patience. Margaret sighed, clearly annoyed, but eventually pulled out the bracelet, placing it in front of him. Be careful with it, she warned. It's worth more than what you probably make in a year. Jalen gritted his teeth but didn't say anything. He reached out, gently picking up the bracelet. It was perfect. The way the charms dangled and sparkled was exactly what he had imagined. But just as he turned it slightly in his hand, the bracelet slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the counter and bouncing off onto the tiled floor below. The moment it hit the ground, Margaret's reaction was instantaneous. "Oh my God, I knew it!" she shrieked, her voice rising sharply. Every head in the store turned toward them. "I knew you were up to something," she shouted, pointing at Jalen. "You were trying to steal it." Jalen's heart sank. He was in shock. He hadn't done anything wrong, but it didn't matter. Margaret was already picking up the phone, dialing frantically for the police. "We've got a thief here," she barked into the receiver. "A young black male in a hoodie tried to steal from us. Get the police here now." Jalen stood frozen, feeling the weight of her words crush him. The store was silent except for Margaret's voice, and he could feel the eyes of every customer on him. He knew what was coming next. The police would arrive soon, and he would be the one arrested. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Jalen's mind raced. He had known that this could happen. He had seen it before on the news. He had heard his mother's warnings about how he should always be careful when he left the house. But now, standing there, waiting for the police to arrive, he realized just how real this situation was. Jalen stood in the center of the jewelry store, his heart pounding in his chest. The bracelet, which had slipped from his fingers and landed on the cold tile floor, seemed to symbolize the precariousness of his entire situation. Margaret Whitmore, the store clerk, was now visibly shaking with indignation. Her face was flushed with anger, and she pointed an accusing finger at Jalen, the words spilling from her mouth in a frantic, almost theatrical manner. "I knew it," she spat. "I knew you were up to something the second you walked in. Thought you could just waltz in here, pick up an expensive bracelet, and leave without anyone noticing?" Her voice was harsh and filled with disdain, as if she had already written him off as a criminal. Jalen's stomach dropped, the weight of her accusations suffocating him. Despite knowing the truth, he felt the sharp sting of being wrongfully labeled. Jalen stood still, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to scream, to tell her how unfair this was, but he knew better than to escalate the situation. He had seen too many stories like this, stories of young black men being unjustly accused, and it never ended well. The mere sight of the bracelet on the floor, combined with his skin color, was enough for her to cast judgment without a second thought. Margaret's eyes never left Jalen as she rushed to the phone, dialing 911 with a force that seemed to reverberate through the room. "I need the police here now," she barked into the receiver. "Young black male, hoodie, tried to steal from me. He's still here." Jalen's breath became shallow as he tried to remain calm, but the rising panic was hard to ignore. His thoughts raced as he prepared himself for what was about to happen. This wasn't just about a bracelet anymore. It was about the weight of history, of systemic injustice that had followed him his entire life. Margaret's tone and her urgency made it clear. She had already made up her mind about him. He wanted to shout, to tell her that he was innocent, but he remained quiet. He didn't have the luxury of reacting the way he wanted to. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to defend himself, but he had seen too many black men fall victim to false accusations. Too many stories where speaking up only made things worse. "Get here fast," Margaret hissed into the phone. "He's getting aggressive." Jalen's stomach turned at her words. Aggressive, he thought. I've barely said anything. He could feel the eyes of the other customers now. their judgment clear in the way they shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flicking between him and the clerk. One woman clutched her purse a little tighter. A man in a suit shook his head, casting a disapproving glance at Jalen as if confirming the accusation. Within minutes, the sharp wail of police sirens cut through the air, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. Jalen's pulse quickened. He knew what was coming. He had seen it on the news, heard the stories of young men being arrested without cause, their lives altered forever by moments like this. Jalen stood frozen in place, trying to control his breath, trying not to show how much fear had started to rise in his chest. Two uniformed officers entered the store, their presence almost immediate and commanding. The room fell silent, all attention now on Jalen. One officer, tall and burly with graying hair, approached him first. His badge read Sergeant Blake. Without a word, he took a step toward Jalen, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them," Blake commanded, his voice sharp. Jalen's hands trembled slightly at his sides. His instincts screamed at him to defend himself, but he knew better. He had to remain calm. He couldn't afford to give them any reason to escalate the situation further. "I didn't do anything," Jalen said, his voice steady despite the rising fear. But before the situation could go any further, another officer, a younger man with sharp eyes, entered the scene. Officer Doyle glanced between Jalen and Margaret, clearly confused. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with doubt. Unlike Sergeant Blake, Doyle seemed unsure. But it didn't matter. Blake was already taking steps forward, reaching for the handcuffs. He didn't wait for the full story. He just assumed guilt based on what he had been told. "Step outside," Sergeant Blake said coldly, his hand tightening on the cuffs. Jalen knew the drill. He had seen it happen to other young black men before, seen how quickly things could spiral out of control. His mind raced through the worst-case scenarios. He could be arrested, charged with something he didn't do, and dragged through a system that had no interest in hearing his side of the story. But just as the officers began to close in on him, Jalen did something unexpected. He didn't move in a panic. Instead, he pulled out his phone, dialed the one person who would believe him, who would stand by him no matter what. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Call my mother," he demanded. The officers paused, momentarily confused by his request. Margaret let out a sarcastic laugh. "Oh, sure, call your mommy," she mocked. "What's she going to do? Tell you to scream for justice?" Jalen ignored her. He was focused on one thing, his mother, Dr. Simone Carter, the chief of police for Riverton PD. She was his ally, his strength, and as soon as she heard his voice, things would change. The heavy glass door of Belmont Jewelers swung open with a soft chime, and in walked a woman who immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Dr. Simone Carter, the chief of police for Riverton PD, was a force to be reckoned with. Tall, poised, and dressed in a navy blue suit, she moved with a confidence that radiated authority. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, each step carrying the weight of her position. Jalen's heart raced as he looked up and saw his mother. The tension in his chest began to ease, though the frustration and anger that had been simmering just beneath the surface still burned. He had never felt more relieved to see her, but he also felt the weight of the moment. His mother wasn't just his protector. She was a symbol of the law, of everything he had been raised to respect and stand by. And now she was about to take control of a situation that had spiraled out of control. As she walked toward the scene, her eyes scanned the room with precision. The moment she spotted Jalen, her expression softened for a fraction of a second, before her gaze hardened with determination. She wasn't just here for her son. She was here to hold people accountable. Simone flashed her badge with a calm authority that left no room for doubt. "I'm Dr. Simone Carter," she announced, her voice firm, cutting through the tension in the room like a sharp blade. "Chief of Police for Riverton PD." She turned her gaze directly onto Sergeant Blake, who was still standing near Jalen, handcuffs in hand. "And this," she said, gesturing to Jalen, "is my son." The room fell into an eerie silence. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Blake, the officer who had been so eager to arrest Jalen, suddenly seemed small and unsure. His body stiffened, his grip on the handcuffs faltering as the weight of Simone's presence settled on him. Doyle, the younger officer, looked from Simone to Jalen and back again, his hesitation now more apparent than ever. Jalen watched as the realization dawned on Blake's face. This wasn't just any teenager. This was Simone Carter's son, a respected figure in the community, and someone who would not tolerate injustice, especially when it was aimed at her child. The thought of arresting him now felt reckless, dangerous even. Simone didn't give Blake a chance to recover. Her voice was low, measured, but it carried an unmistakable edge. "Sergeant, I assume you have a reasonable explanation for why my son is standing here, surrounded by officers, about to be handcuffed?" Her question wasn't just an inquiry, it was a challenge, a demand for accountability. Her gaze locked onto Blake, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he tried to gather his thoughts. He stammered, "We received a call reporting an attempted theft, and we responded accordingly." But Simone wasn't having it. Her sharp eyes narrowed and she took a step forward, her presence towering over the officer. "And by accordingly, you mean you saw a young black man, assumed he was guilty, and immediately reached for your handcuffs?" She countered, her tone dripping with disbelief. Margaret, who had been standing at the counter, suddenly found her voice. "I called because he tried to steal from me," she spat, pointing at Jalen with a finger that trembled with rage. "He dropped the bracelet and was about to take it." Her voice cracked with indignation as she continued. "I did what any responsible citizen would do. I called the police before he could get away." Simone's eyes never left Margaret. The air between them crackled with an intensity that made everyone in the store uncomfortable. "You called the police because you saw a young black man in your store, and you assumed he was a criminal. But you never even checked the security footage, did you?" Simone's voice was steady, but her words were sharp enough to cut through the tension. She turned to Blake and added, "Did you even do your job before you came charging in here with handcuffs ready?" Blake's face reddened, and he remained silent. Simone's questions were too direct, too damning. He had assumed Jalen was guilty before even considering the possibility that he wasn't. But the weight of Simone's authority in that moment was undeniable. Doyle, the younger officer, had already begun to look uncomfortable. He shifted from one foot to the other, his gaze flicking nervously between Simone and the other officers. "We should check the footage," Doyle finally suggested, his voice a little more tentative than before. Simone nodded, her gaze never leaving Blake. "Please," she said coolly, "do your job." As the manager hurried to retrieve the security footage, Simone turned back to Jalen, her eyes softening for a brief moment. "You okay?" she asked, her voice quieter now, a mother's concern threading through the steel of her authority. Jalen didn't answer right away. He felt a lump form in his throat as he met his mother's gaze. The anger that had built up in him seemed to dissipate in her presence. She wasn't just his protector. She was a reminder that, despite the world's injustices, he wasn't alone. The footage came up on the screen, and the entire room fell silent as they watched the sequence of events unfold. There was Jalen entering the store, speaking to Margaret, handing over the money for the bracelet, and then, just as he had described, the bracelet slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor. No theft, no malicious intent, just a young man trying to buy a gift for his sister. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face had gone white, her arrogance replaced by a stunned realization that she had been wrong. Blake, too, seemed to shrink under the weight of the footage, his body stiffening as he realized the mistake he had almost made. Simone stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she turned to Blake. "So," she said, her voice measured but full of authority, "now that the evidence has been reviewed, what happens next?" Jalen couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory as he watched the officers shift uncomfortably, knowing they were caught in their own misjudgment. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about accountability, about standing up, even when the system failed you. It was about showing the world that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, would always rise to the surface. As the tension in the store continued to escalate, Margaret's confidence started to unravel. The cool composure she had once displayed was now slipping from her grasp. Her posture, once stiff with superiority, began to tremble. She stood frozen, eyes darting between Simone, Jalen, and the two officers, each of them radiating authority. A sense of panic began to sink in. Her entire worldview was being questioned in front of her, and there was nowhere for her to hide from the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. Simone stood still, unwavering, her sharp gaze focused entirely on Margaret. Her voice, when it came, was like ice cutting through the dense air. "Let me make something clear to you," she said, her tone deliberate and filled with quiet menace. "You've just accused my son of stealing, based on your assumption that a black teenager doesn't belong here, doesn't deserve to be in this store. And in doing so, you've demonstrated exactly what you're truly about." Margaret's face flushed. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The smug arrogance she had worn so comfortably moments ago had evaporated, leaving behind only embarrassment and regret. Her hand, which had previously rested so confidently on the phone when calling the police, now hung limply by her side. The room was still, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning above. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for her to respond, and yet Margaret was trapped in silence. Simone's eyes never wavered from Margaret's face, her gaze unyielding and powerful. "My son came in here today to buy a gift for his sister," she continued, her voice a blend of authority and controlled anger. "He worked hard for that money. He didn't come here to steal. But you—" Simone's hand moved slowly, pointing directly at Margaret. "You immediately assumed he was guilty because of the color of his skin. You assumed he didn't belong here." Simone's words landed with a force that seemed to make the very air in the room grow heavier. Margaret's chest tightened, and for the first time she felt herself sinking. She had been so sure of her actions, so confident in her assumptions. But now, with each word Simone spoke, the foundation beneath her was crumbling. The silence stretched on, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was a suffocating stillness that only intensified the shame that was now creeping into Margaret's mind. She blinked rapidly, trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. Simone's presence was a force of nature, unyielding and absolute. The very room seemed to tilt toward her as the other customers, who had once silently judged Jalen, began to shift uncomfortably in their spots. There was no defending Margaret now. She had gone too far. Simone took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and Margaret. Her voice lowered, carrying a dangerous undercurrent. "This isn't just about an accusation. This is about how you saw a black boy and decided he was guilty before he even had a chance to speak for himself. This is about the way you've treated him. How dare you?" Margaret opened her mouth again, but the words caught in her throat. She had been so certain, so sure of herself, but now the ground had slipped from beneath her. It was as if she had been exposed for all the world to see, and in that moment, all the confidence she had displayed was replaced with something far less powerful: fear. Fear of being exposed, of being found out, of being seen for what she really was. Simone's eyes narrowed as she took in Margaret's reaction. "I hope you realize," she continued, her tone calm yet filled with authority, "that your actions have consequences. You don't get to treat people like this without it coming back to you. You don't get to accuse a young man of theft based on nothing but your own prejudice." The silence in the store was now so thick that it felt like it was pressing down on Margaret, on everyone. The weight of Simone's words, her unwavering conviction, seemed to seep into the very walls. Margaret's shoulders sagged as if all the air had been sucked from her. She wanted to say something, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. The reality of the situation was too much for her to handle. Margaret shifted her weight uneasily, glancing at the officers for support. But none of them moved. They stood there, their eyes downcast, their hands slightly loosening their grips. They had witnessed something that had shaken them to their core. Simone's unflinching resolve had left them with no room to defend their earlier actions. One of the officers, Doyle, who had hesitated earlier, shifted his stance. He exhaled sharply, his eyes moving from Simone to Margaret. He finally spoke, his voice soft but filled with regret. "I think we need to check the security footage," he said, his gaze flickering between the two women. Blake, the older officer, stiffened at Doyle's words, his hand tightening on his cuffs as if to hold on to some last shred of authority. But Simone was already ahead of them. "Yes," she said, her voice biting. "You should check the footage. Maybe you'll see for yourselves just how wrong you were." Simone's confidence and power were undeniable now. The room seemed to shift as the manager, who had been standing in the background frozen in shock, hurried to the back to retrieve the footage. When it played on the small screen, every second of Jalen's visit to the store was displayed. There was no theft, no pocketing, no crime. Just a young man who had worked hard to buy a gift for his sister. The footage was irrefutable. The truth was there, laid bare for everyone to see. Margaret, who had been so sure of herself, now stood motionless, her face ashen. She had no defense. She couldn't deny the truth that was staring at her in the face. Simone turned to Blake, her gaze never leaving Margaret. "Sergeant," she said, her voice low and controlled, "I assume you have a reasonable explanation for why you almost arrested my son without even reviewing the evidence?" Blake's jaw tightened as he struggled to respond. He didn't have an answer, not anymore. He had been caught in a situation he couldn't explain, and the reality of it was settling in like a weight on his chest. Margaret opened her mouth again, her voice trembling, but the words were meaningless. Her entire argument had collapsed under the weight of Simone's words and the undeniable truth captured on the security footage. Simone stepped back, her hand gently resting on Jalen's shoulder. "Let's go, baby," she murmured, her voice softer now. Jalen didn't move right away. He stood there looking at Margaret, at Blake, at the officers, and at the customers who had been complicit in their silence. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel the relief that he should have. Instead, he felt exhausted. He felt weary of the constant battles he had to fight, of the endless prejudice he had to endure. But as he turned and walked out with his mother, he knew one thing. This fight wasn't over. And no matter what came next, he wouldn't be fighting it alone. As the confrontation inside Belmont Jewelers came to a close, the weight of the moment still lingered in the air. Jalen and Simone stepped outside into the cool afternoon, the tension that had once gripped them now giving way to a bittersweet relief. The loud ringing of the store's door chime seemed to mark the end of the storm, but for Jalen, there was no true sense of victory. The battle had been won, but the war, one that had raged for centuries, was far from over. Simone could see the exhaustion in her son's posture as he walked beside her. He hadn't said much since they left the store, his eyes focused ahead, deep in thought. The fight they had just been through, one that should have never been necessary, had taken a toll on both of them. Despite Simone's calm and controlled demeanor throughout the incident, she couldn't help but feel the weight of a cycle that seemed impossible to break. When they reached her car, Simone stopped, turning to face Jalen. Her gaze softened, but her words were sharp and full of meaning. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice quiet, yet holding the same authority she had used inside the store. Jalen exhaled slowly, his chest tight. He wanted to say that everything was fine, that he was just relieved it was over, but the truth was more complicated than that. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I feel angry and tired, and like none of it really matters." He shook his head, the words tumbling out with a frustration that had been building for years. "Because tomorrow it'll be someone else, and no one will stop to ask if they're okay." Simone's expression softened as she reached out to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, baby," she said quietly. "It's a cycle that keeps repeating, but today we fought back. Today you didn't let them break you." Jalen swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "I stood there," he said, his eyes slightly glassy. "I listened to her talk about me like I was nothing. And even when she got caught, even when she knew she was wrong, she couldn't say the words. I don't know how to fight back against something that deep. How do you make people see you as a person when they've already decided you're not?" Simone inhaled deeply, the weight of her own experiences reflected in her eyes. She didn't answer right away, and for a moment, the only sound between them was the soft hum of the engine. Then she spoke, her voice steady, almost matter-of-fact. "By refusing to let them define you, by showing them, over and over again, that they're wrong, even when they refuse to admit it." Jalen nodded slowly, though the feeling of helplessness still gnawed at him. The injustice he had faced in that store was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that he had to continue to navigate for the rest of his life. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. The tension that had marked their earlier conversation had begun to ease. Then, as if on cue, Simone reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Jalen glanced at her, eyebrows raised in curiosity. "Who are you calling?" he asked, feeling a bit wary. Simone didn't answer immediately. She scrolled through her contacts, pausing before dialing a number. After a few rings, she spoke into the phone, her tone professional, almost cold. "Cynthia, I need a press release prepared immediately. Yes, regarding Belmont Jewelers." She glanced at Jalen, her expression unreadable as she continued speaking. "I want a full investigation into the call that was made to dispatch, and I want an internal review on Sergeant Blake. Also, make sure the media knows exactly what happened today." Jalen's eyes widened slightly. "You're really going after them?" he asked, a mix of disbelief and admiration in his voice. Simone gave him a knowing look, her gaze unwavering. "You think I was just going to let this go?" she asked, her voice firm with conviction. Jalen's heart softened. It wasn't just about his own fight anymore. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that people like Margaret, who thought they could get away with their prejudice, faced consequences. Simone's call continued as Jalen absorbed the magnitude of what she was doing. It wasn't just about righting the wrong in that store. It was about making sure that no one else had to face the same kind of treatment that Jalen had. And maybe, just maybe, it was a small step in changing the larger narrative. Later, the consequences for Margaret Whitmore and the officers involved began to unfold. Belmont Jewelers became the subject of widespread media coverage. The store was inundated with one-star reviews. A full investigation into the police response was launched, and Margaret was placed on indefinite leave. News stations ran segments detailing what had happened that afternoon, with public outrage fueling the momentum for change. Jalen read through the articles, barely processing the words on his phone. He should have felt victorious, but instead, the hollow feeling of a battle half won lingered. "If my mom wasn't who she was, how different would this story have been?" he thought to himself, wondering if he could ever escape the constant weight of being judged for his skin color. But today he knew one thing. He didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. As Jalen walked into his home, his younger sister Aaliyah ran up to him excitedly, holding the silver bracelet he had originally planned to buy. "Jalen, look what Mom got me," she exclaimed. Jalen paused for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened still hanging over him, but he forced a smile. "You like it, Aaliyah?" he asked, his voice soft. "Are you kidding? It's perfect," she beamed, completely unaware of the storm her brother had just weathered. Jalen nodded, his heart lightening a little. "That's all that matters," he said, watching her dash off to show their mother. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a better future. The next morning, the ripple effects of the incident at Belmont Jewelers spread through Riverton. What started as a tense confrontation between a young black teen and a prejudiced store clerk had quickly snowballed into a public scandal that no one saw coming. Jalen, though still processing the events, found himself thrust into the spotlight. The media storm began almost immediately after Simone's press release, which had been strategically crafted to expose the racial profiling that had taken place and demand accountability for everyone involved. As the story went viral, Jalen scrolled through the news articles on his phone, watching as the small suburban town he'd known his whole life became the focal point of a much larger conversation about racial profiling, systemic bias, and law enforcement's treatment of black individuals. Headlines like, "Teen accused of stealing jewelry proves innocence, exposes store's racial bias," and "Local police officers under scrutiny after wrongfully detaining teen" flashed across the screen. Jalen's heart was heavy as he read. Though justice had been served, it felt as though the story was still unfolding, and he was merely an observer, watching it all from the sidelines. He couldn't help but feel a sense of disconnection from it all. His mother, Riverton's chief of police, had used her power to hold the system accountable, and now it was out of his hands. But what did it really mean for him? The town was divided. Some residents rallied behind Jalen, applauding his composure in the face of such blatant injustice. Others, particularly those who had turned a blind eye to the racism woven into the fabric of their community, found themselves feeling uncomfortable as the truth came to light. It was evident that things were shifting, but it wasn't clear how far the ripple effects would reach. Jalen's thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang again. His mother's name flashed on the screen. "Hey, Mom," he answered, trying to sound more upbeat than he felt. Hey, baby. Simone's voice was calm but filled with an undercurrent of determination. I wanted to check in. I know this has been a lot, but I need you to know that what you did is bigger than just this incident. Jalen sighed, looking out the window at the familiar streets of Riverton. I don't know, Mom. I appreciate everything you've done, but it's not like anything's really going to change. We're just going to keep having the same conversations, over and over again. Simone paused on the other end of the line, her voice quieter now. Jalen, I know this battle feels endless, and I know it's exhausting, but you don't have to do it alone. That's why we're making noise. That's why we're not letting this go. What we did together, what you did, showed people that they can't get away with this kind of behavior. And you know what? The conversation is changing. Maybe it's slow, but it's moving. Jalen wasn't sure if he felt relieved or overwhelmed by her words. It was hard to imagine real change when every day, everywhere he looked, he saw the same injustices being played out. He couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before people started to truly listen. Simone continued, her tone firm. We've set something in motion, Jalen. The investigation into Sergeant Blake is just the beginning. We're going to make sure that those who tried to silence you, who tried to make you a victim, are held accountable. But this isn't just about them. It's about the people who watched, the people who stayed silent. It's about the stores that continue to stereotype, the people who make assumptions because of how someone looks. The change doesn't happen just because one person steps up. It happens when everyone decides to stand up. Her words resonated deep inside Jalen, though he didn't fully believe them yet. He felt the shift, but it was still hard to see how it would play out in the long term. Would the people who had quietly supported Margaret, who hadn't questioned her authority, who had let her accusations fly without a second thought, ever come to understand the consequences of their actions? Jalen couldn't help but think back to the customers who had looked at him with judgment, who had quickly accepted Margaret's narrative, not because they knew him, but because they believed the story that matched their preconceived notions. Would they be willing to confront their own biases, or would they remain silent in the face of discomfort? Days later, the results of the investigation were released. Belmont Jewelers faced a storm of backlash, with thousands of online reviews flooding their Yelp page, mostly one-star ratings. The store's management issued a public apology, but it was clear that their damage control efforts couldn't erase the truth. Margaret Whitmore, the store clerk who had falsely accused Jalen, was placed on indefinite leave. Rumors swirled that she had been fired, but no official statement was made. Simone had won her battle against the system, but Jalen knew that this was just one skirmish in a much larger war. People like Margaret and Sergeant Blake weren't the only ones who needed to be held accountable. Everyone who had turned a blind eye to racial injustice, everyone who had silently condoned these actions, had to answer for their complicity. The changes that followed were small, but they were there. The town of Riverton began to have real conversations about racial profiling and implicit bias, conversations that had never been possible before. Local leaders, teachers, and law enforcement officers participated in community dialogues, and for the first time, it seemed that people were truly listening. But Jalen's victory didn't come without sacrifice. While he had stood tall in the face of injustice, the emotional toll of the experience weighed on him. He had always known that he was different, his identity shaped by his race, his upbringing, his skin. But now it was harder to deny that his very presence in certain spaces would always be scrutinized, questioned, and judged. Yet as Jalen lay in bed that night, scrolling through the social media posts, the pictures of him with his mother, and the outpouring of support from people he'd never met, he felt a sense of quiet pride. The fight wasn't over, but it was his to carry. It was his story to tell. And for the first time in a long while, Jalen felt seen. The public fallout was only the beginning. There was still much work to do, and Jalen knew that he couldn't do it alone. But he didn't have to. His mother and the people who stood beside him would keep fighting. The ripples of this incident would continue to spread, and for once, Jalen was ready to be a part of that change. The aftermath of the incident at Belmont Jewelers left Jalen in a place he had never expected. Despite the outward victory, the media frenzy, the public apologies, the investigation into Sergeant Blake's actions, he couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion. The fight for justice that had been sparked by his mother's quick intervention was still unresolved in his mind. He felt like a battle had been won, but the war was far from over. He was proud of what they had accomplished. But as he walked away from the store, a weight hung in the air, like a storm cloud that hadn't quite passed. As the days went on, the town of Riverton seemed to settle into its rhythm. Jalen's classmates offered their support, some with genuine care, others with awkward sympathy. The story had become a local legend, a tale of racial bias and the power of accountability. Jalen's name was now associated with something much bigger than just an unfortunate incident at a jewelry store. He had become a symbol, a face of the larger fight for justice that people like him had been waging for years. It felt strange being seen as an emblem of change when all he had done was try to buy a bracelet for his little sister. He couldn't stop thinking about how it felt in that store, how the accusation from Margaret had been so visceral, so suffocating. Every word she said, every glance from the customers, had reinforced the belief that he didn't belong, as if simply by walking into that store, he had broken some unspoken rule about who could buy luxury items. The humiliation was something that clung to him. It wasn't just the fact that Margaret had falsely accused him. It was the way the entire system had almost reinforced her beliefs, the way law enforcement had been quick to believe her, without even considering his side of the story. It was a painful reminder of the reality that many Black men and women face every day, an ever-present sense of being judged based on skin color, not character. It wasn't until he sat down with his mother a few nights later that he started to unpack his feelings. They were sitting in the living room of their home, the sound of the TV humming in the background, but neither of them were paying attention to it. Simone had been the pillar of strength throughout this ordeal, handling the pressure of her position as chief of police with grace and poise. But tonight, Jalen wanted to talk about something more personal. "Mom," he began, his voice uncertain, "do you ever feel like it's never enough? Like no matter what you do, it still doesn't change anything?" Simone looked at him, her eyes softening. She had expected this moment. She knew her son was wrestling with the weight of everything that had happened. "I do," she admitted, her tone gentle. "It's a question I've asked myself many times. But you know what I've realized? It's not about winning the fight in one moment. It's about pushing and pushing and pushing. Even when it feels like you're not getting anywhere, you're still moving the needle." Jalen frowned, a knot forming in his chest. "But it doesn't feel like we're moving the needle, Mom. It feels like we're just repeating the same things over and over again." I stood up for myself. "We got the apology. But that's it, right? What happens next?" Simone's expression grew more serious. She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. "Jalen, what we did wasn't just about you. It was about showing people that they can't get away with this. It was about making sure that the story is heard, that people are held accountable, and that those who stand in the face of injustice know they're not alone. We can't stop fighting just because we don't see immediate results. Change is slow, but it's happening." Jalen's thoughts raced, but her words did something for him. They reminded him of something his mother had always taught him, that real change wasn't always visible right away. It didn't always come with immediate applause or clear victories. Sometimes it was in the quiet conversations, the small moments where people reflected on their actions and learned from them. Change was a process, not a destination. "I guess I just don't want to keep fighting the same fight over and over again," Jalen said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I understand," Simone replied softly. "But remember, Jalen, you're not fighting this fight alone. You've got a whole community behind you, and we're going to keep pushing. And one day, maybe not tomorrow or next year, but one day things will be different. And when that happens, we'll know that we had a part in making that change." Jalen exhaled slowly, his chest loosening just a little. The weight of the past few days, the months of saving for his sister's gift, the stress of the public fallout, all seemed to ease a little. He still felt the sting of what had happened, but maybe that wasn't something he had to carry alone. Maybe this fight wasn't just about him. Maybe, like his mother said, he was a part of something bigger. The conversation with Simone didn't provide all the answers Jalen was looking for, but it gave him something else: Hope. Maybe change didn't always come in the form of a big victory. Maybe sometimes it came in the quiet moments, the decisions we make when we stand up for what's right, even when we're unsure of the outcome. As Jalen sat there with his mother, watching the lights of Riverton twinkle through the window, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let the weight of this moment define him. He was going to move forward one step at a time, just like his mother had taught him. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And now, for the first time, Jalen was ready to be a part of it. One of the key lessons this story teaches is the power of patience and standing up against injustice, even in difficult circumstances. Jalen, a young black man, simply wanted to buy a gift for his sister, but he faced suspicion and prejudice because of his race. However, through his resilience and support from his mother, a powerful ally, Jalen was able to expose the injustice and reclaim his dignity. The story highlights that in situations of injustice, change may not come immediately, but speaking out and taking the right actions are still essential. For older audiences, this lesson holds even more significance. It shows that no matter our age, the fight for justice and what is right remains valuable. Life's difficulties and challenges are not reasons to give up. They are opportunities to stand up and contribute to change. The story affirms that perseverance and determination can change even the most deeply rooted systems, and every individual can make a difference. No matter how small the action may seem,